Okay, let's dive in. When you think about Nepal, maybe the first things that come to mind are, the Himalayas, Mount Everest, incredible landscapes.
Right, stunning scenery.
Exactly. But what you probably don't immediately picture is a country going through this, well, almost unbelievable change in how people get around.
Mm,
But that's where it gets really fascinating because this landlocked developing nation is seeing an electric vehicle boom that's not just growing fast, but hitting market shares that are actually outpacing a lot of wealthier countries.
it's quite the unexpected story, isn't it? A really powerful transformation happening right now.
It is, and the sources we've been looking at, they really paint this picture of a dramatic shift.
Yeah, it feels less like a gradual change and more like someone hit the fast forward button on their whole auto market.
Totally. And that's what this deep dive is all about today. We're going to explore this phenomenon, the incredibly fast adoption of EVs in Nepal.
We've got quite a stack of material here, haven't we? Articles from places like the Annapurna Express, Rising Nepal, Kathmandu Post, Republica.
Yeah, industry reports too, environmental analysis from ehn.org, and even some online chats from Reddit, which kind of give you that on-the-ground consumer feel.
So our mission, really, is to go through all this together, pull out the key insights we want to understand based on these sources. Why is this happening so fast?
Right.
What are the actual impacts the sources are talking about? And crucially, what are the big challenges that still lie ahead, according to the reporting and the experts?
Think of this as like your shortcut to getting up to speed on this really specific, pretty amazing case study in global EV adoption. We're just going to unpack it all together, you and us, sifting through the data, the perspectives, figuring out what really matters.
Okay, sounds good. Where should we start?
Let's jump right into the scale and speed because the numbers are, honestly, they're kind of mind-blowing.
They really are. The import data alone tells a huge story. The main thing is the number of EVs coming in hasn't just gone up, it's exploded, like exponentially in a really short time.
Yeah, multiple sources are saying EV imports basically doubled each of the past 2 years.
Doubled year on year. That's not just growth, that's like hyper-acceleration you almost never see.
Exactly. We're seeing figures like 11,701 units imported in the fiscal year 2023-24. One source, Annapurna Express, puts the growth that year at a massive 188.91% over the previous one.
Wow, nearly tripling imports in just 12 months. That's huge.
And it doesn't seem to be slowing much based on the more recent numbers. Annapurna Express also mentioned nearly 8,000 units imported in just the first 9 months of the next fiscal year, 24-25.
Right, and Republic had a figure around mid-June of the current fiscal year, saying the total was already 11,466 units. So even partway through the year, the numbers are still pointing towards really strong, sustained growth.
And just to give you some context for how dramatic this is, Rising Nepal points out that just a few years back, in fiscal year 2020-21, they only imported 249 units.
249. Compare that to over 11,000 just 3 years later. That's
Right. And the Kathmandu Post had this really stark figure. Passenger EV imports just from China jumped 35-fold. 35 times higher in only 5 years.
That's almost unbelievable.
Yeah.
And when you translate those import numbers into actual market share of new car sales, that's where Nepal's story becomes really, really significant on a global level.
Yeah, an interview with Tata Motors suggested EV penetration in new car sales is hitting nearly 80%.
Nearly 80%. Fast Company had it a bit lower for last year, maybe around 65%. But even 65% is just astronomical compared to, say, the U.S., where it's, maybe 9% right now?
Right. So Nepal isn't just seeing growth, it's achieving market share in new sales that's way up there, sometimes even beating markets that are much richer and have had EV policies for way longer.
And it's not only about private cars. The sources make a point of highlighting this massive shift happening in public transport, too.
Oh yeah, the three-wheeled minibuses, the tempos.
Exactly. EHN.org reported adoption rates for those went from basically nothing, less than 1%, up to 83%.
83%. That's almost a complete switch for that specific type of commercial vehicle. Incredible.
And it's moving into bigger vehicles, too. Orja Kabar had this observation that on the Dungadi route, something like 60% of the four-wheeler public passenger vehicles are now EVs.
60% already operating.
And maybe even more telling, nearly 80% of the newly bought vans on that same route are electric.
So when operators are replacing their old vehicles, they're choosing electric. It's becoming the default.
Seems like it, in that segment at least. Which means they're actually hitting or even blasting past Some pretty ambitious government targets, way ahead of schedule.
Right, I saw that. Nepal's climate plan, the second NDC, set targets like 20% electric for four-wheeler public passenger vehicle sales by 2025 and 60% by 2030.
And Urja Kabar is suggesting that 2030 target of 60% is already being met right now in some areas like that Dangadi route, years early.
That's amazing progress. What about the overall national targets?
Also pretty ambitious. HT Auto and Annapurna Express mention targets like 25% of all auto sales being electric by 2025, and then a huge jump to 90% by 2030.
90% by 2030, wow.
Yeah, it's aggressive. But looking at the current rates, especially in passenger cars, they seem well on track, if they can keep this momentum going.
Okay, so the scale is huge, the speed is breakneck. Who's actually supplying all these EVs? Where are they coming from?
The sources are really clear on this. It's basically a two-horse race between China and India.
Okay.
And China's really pulled ahead recently to become the dominant supplier. Annapurna Express said China accounted for just over 74% of total EV imports in the first 9 months of FY 2024-25.
74%, that's a huge share.
Yeah, and Kathmandu Post backs that up, showing 69% over 11 months of the current fiscal year. So definitely the major player.
And are specific brands leading the way from China?
Yes. The sources like Annapurna Express and Kathmandu Post specifically call out BYD, particularly their Atto 3 and Dolphin models, and also Dongfeng. They seem to be capturing a big chunk of that market.
Okay, BYD and Dongfeng from China. What about India?
India's the second biggest supplier, holding around 25% market share in the recent data. And Tata Motors is a really significant player there.
Right, the Tata interview talked about their strong presence. Models like the Nexon EV, Tiago EV.
Yeah, and the new Punch EV that they're actively pushing in the market. So Tata is definitely a major force from the Indian side.
It's interesting, Kathmandu Post mentioned a shift, right? That India used to be the top supplier.
That's right. Until the last fiscal year, India was actually #1. But BYD's performance has really surged, letting China take over the top spot more recently.
And imports from other places, Germany, the US, Korea?
Minimal. According to the Annapurna Express data, it really emphasizes this China-India dominance in the passenger EV space that the sources describe, a clear duopoly.
Okay, so we've got the what? Astonishing growth, huge market share, and the who, mainly China and India, with BYD and Tata as key brands. Now let's get into the why. What's actually driving this incredible surge in a place like Nepal? What makes going electric so compelling there?
Well, the sources point to a combination of factors, but you really have to start with government policy. That seems to be the spark that lit the fire. Specifically, a radical drop in import duties and excise taxes back in July 2021.
Right. Fast Company flagged that as the key policy change that really kicked things off. Suddenly, the upfront cost of buying an EV just plummeted compared to a traditional petrol or diesel car.
Exactly, an ICE vehicle, yeah. And the difference in duties is just massive. Multiple sources, HT Auto, Annapurna Express, Rising Nepal, you report, they all detail this. Petrol and diesel cars face these incredibly high duties, often 200% to over 300%.
Wow, 300%.
Yeah, whereas EVs, depending on their motor power, their duties are much, much lower, ranging from maybe 15% up to 90%.
That's a world of difference.
It really is.
Yeah.
And Rising Nepal specifically points out that Nepal is pretty unique globally in offering such big customs exemptions specifically for EVs compared to traditional cars.
So that tax difference just completely changes the game on the sticker price. Makes EVs suddenly affordable or even cheaper upfront in many cases.
Precisely. And it wasn't just the duties. Favorable bank financing was another critical piece of the puzzle. Several sources, like Eve Reporter and Kathmandu Post, mentioned that banks were offering much better loan terms for EVs.
How much better?
Originally, they were offering loans covering up to 90% of the EV's price. Compare that to just 50% for a petrol or diesel car.
90% financing versus 50. Okay. That makes a huge difference in accessibility for people who need loans, which is probably most buyers.
Absolutely. It made buying an EV much more feasible for a lot more individuals and businesses. And then there were other smaller incentives too, like subsidized electricity rates for charging stations,
Oh.
mentioned by Eve Reporter and Rising Nepal, and also really low annual road tax for EVs, according to Eve Reporter. So the government essentially created this very pro-EV environment, really stacking the deck in favor of electric.
All right, so policy created the opening with lower purchase costs and easier financing, but then the economics for the consumer and the nation seem to be a massive ongoing driver, right? Once people actually start using these things.
Oh, absolutely. Pulling it all together, The core economic message for consumers is simple. EVs became way cheaper to buy, way cheaper to run, and cheaper to maintain compared to petrol or diesel. Let's break down how the sources show that. First, the savings on fuel are just enormous. There was this anecdote on Reddit.
Yeah.
A user said a trip from Kathmandu to Muggling cost them less than 150 rupees in their EV compared to 1,500 rupees for the same trip in a petrol car.
Wow, a tenth of the cost.
Exactly. And HT Auto reported on a public van driver whose daily fuel costs dropped from around $40 for diesel down to just $6 for charging.
$40 down to $6 every single day for a commercial driver. That's transformative for their income, for their business.
Totally. Fast Company mentioned electric buses costing 33 times less to charge than diesel buses. Rising Nepal gave another example. Driving 200 kilometers costs about 200 rupees for an EV versus over 2,000 for petrol. They generally stated EVs are 10 to 15 times cheaper to run.
10 to 15 times cheaper. That difference in running cost alone is just a massive incentive, especially for anyone driving a lot, like taxi drivers or delivery vans.
Definitely. And on top of the fuel savings, you've got lower maintenance costs. Mer Auto, Rising Nepal, Kathmandu Post, they all point out that EVs are just mechanically simpler. Far fewer moving parts than an ICE vehicle.
Right. No oil changes, no complex exhaust systems.
Exactly. Fewer things to break, less routine maintenance, less money spent on repairs over the car's lifetime.
That Reddit thread you mentioned didn't have an anecdote about maintenance costs, too?
Yeah, someone with a Kia Soul EV said their total maintenance bill over 7 years was less than 1 lakh rupees.
100,000 rupees over 7 years. That's roughly, what, 750 to $1,000 US? That's incredibly low for keeping a car running that long.
It really is, especially...
So the total cost of ownership just plummeted.
Pretty much. HT Auto even quoted someone saying that because of the tax breaks, they could afford a much, much more luxurious car for the same price by choosing electric.
Okay, so cheaper to buy thanks to policy, way cheaper to run on fuel, cheaper to maintain. That's just an overwhelming economic case for the individual or business owner. But the sources also stress these big macroeconomic benefits for Nepal as a whole, right?
Yes, absolutely critical. This shift directly cuts down Nepal's heavy reliance on imported fossil fuels, which are really expensive.
How much are we talking in savings?
HT Auto estimated it was saving the country about $22 million a year and growing. And Annapurna Express and Rising Nepal report a figure of 11.07 billion rupees saved just in the 2023-24 fiscal year because petroleum imports dropped.
11 billion rupees. That's roughly 83 million US dollars just in 1 year.
Exactly. Huge savings in foreign currency. And that directly helps tackle the country's big trade deficit, which is a major economic headache for the government. Several sources, like EV Reporter and Rising Nepal, explicitly link EV adoption to this national economic benefit.
Okay, so strong policy, massive economic benefits. What about environmental drivers? Is that a big factor?
It definitely seems to be, especially in urban areas like Kathmandu. Fast Company and HT Auto described Kathmandu as having some of the worst air pollution in the world.
Yeah, I've read about that. It's a serious problem.
And vehicle emissions are a huge part of that problem, a major contributor to that deadly air pollution, according to ehn.org. It's not just environmental. It's a public health crisis.
So EVs with no tailpipe emissions offer a direct solution there.
Right. ehn.org, HT Auto, Kathmandu Post all highlight this immediate benefit for cleaning up urban air. Plus, it helps Nepal meet its climate goals, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, work towards net zero targets.
ehm.org had a really striking statistic, didn't they, about lifespan?
Yeah, based on research, they suggested that cutting down those fine particles from vehicle exhaust, which EVs eliminate at the source, could add over 2 years to the average person's lifespan in Nepal, just by improving the air quality.
2 extra years of life, on average. That's an incredible public health impact.
It really puts it in perspective. And here's a crucial point that many sources emphasize. Nepal's electricity is overwhelmingly generated from clean hydropower.
Right, that's key. Unlike places where the grid is still mostly coal or gas.
Exactly. HT Auto, Fast Company, EV Reporter, Rising Nepal, they all stress this. It means that charging an EV in Nepal is genuinely clean, from source to wheel. As Fast Company points out, this makes Nepal's EV transition much more impactful environmentally than in countries still relying heavily on fossil fuels for power generation. The clean grid really magnifies the benefits.
Okay, that's a really important synergy. Are there any other factors, maybe geographic ones?
Yeah, a couple of sources, Eve Reporter and the Tata Motors interview, touch on this. They suggest Nepal's geography, things like relatively short distances between cities, even if the travel times are long due to road conditions, makes current EV ranges often practical for typical daily use.
Interesting. So range anxiety might be less of a practical barrier day to day for many people than you'd think.
Potentially for typical commutes or local travel, and the climate, generally tropical, is also pretty good for battery performance compared to extreme cold, for instance.
And what about just people getting excited about it? Consumer demand?
Definitely seems to be a factor now. Rising Nepal mentions growing awareness and enthusiasm. And HT Auto shared those stories of public van drivers who switched and were really happy with the savings and the driving experience. That word-of-mouth effect is likely powerful.
Okay, so let's recap the why. You've got this powerful mix, really aggressive government policy, slashing costs, and easing finance. Huge economic wins for both consumers and the country through massive running and maintenance savings, plus reduced fuel import. Clear environmental and health benefits, especially with that clean hydropower grid.
Crucial point.
And maybe even a geographic context that's reasonably well suited. It all comes together to explain that incredible speed and market share we saw in the numbers.
Exactly. It created this almost perfect storm for rapid EV adoption.
It makes total sense why the numbers shot up like they did. But like any huge, fast change, there have got to be challenges, right? Hurdles. The sources must talk about the downsides or the difficulties.
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely not all smooth sailing. The speed of adoption seems to be creating some serious growing pains, particularly around infrastructure and policy consistency.
Okay, let's dig into those potholes on the EV road. What's the biggest one?
Charging infrastructure comes up again and again. While progress has been made, multiple sources, Urja Kabar, Fast Company, Rising Nepal, describe the network as still limited and a major challenge.
How many stations are there? I saw some numbers.
Yeah, Urja Kabar and MyRepublica put the total number built by the government utility, NEA, and private companies somewhere around 400 to 460 nationwide. And there are plans to double that.
400-odd stations. Doesn't sound terrible on its own.
Maybe not. But the same sources immediately highlight the real-world problems. Stations being overcrowded, people facing long waits, sometimes 30 minutes, sometimes hours, especially at busy times or key spots.
Ah, okay. So the number might be growing, but the usability is still an issue. That feeds right into range anxiety, doesn't it? Like that Reddit discussion mentioned.
Exactly. Even if your daily drive is short, knowing you might face a long queue or find a charger occupied just adds stress, especially for commercial drivers who need predictable schedules.
Urja Kabar went into some detail about the problems developing the network, right? Something about transformers.
Yes, they pointed out that the state utility, NEA, helps private developers by extending the grid connection and providing transformers, but only up to a certain size 200 kVA. But if a private company wants to set up a larger station, maybe with multiple fast chargers, they need a bigger, more expensive transformer, and they have to buy that themselves.
So it creates a barrier to building the kind of larger, faster charging hubs that are probably needed.
Seems like it. The article suggests there's a clear need for bigger facilities and also for a centralized management system, a CMS, to make the whole network more efficient and user-friendly.
And there was another issue with the charging stations, something about profitability.
Yes, Urja Kabar detailed this really interesting problem linked to Nepal's Consumer Protection Act. Apparently, the law limits businesses to a maximum 20% profit margin on selling electricity.
Okay, 20%. Why is that a problem for charging stations?
Well, according to the article, if selling electricity is the main or only way these stations make money, that 20% margin on the standard electricity tariff just isn't enough to cover the huge costs of setting up the station, the chargers, the land, the grid connection, ongoing maintenance, especially for expensive fast chargers.
Right, so the regulation aimed at protecting consumers accidentally makes the basic business model of selling charging by the kilowatt hour unsustainable.
That seems to be the argument in the source. It just doesn't generate enough revenue to make it viable based purely on regulated electricity sales.
So how are they managing then? Are they just losing money?
Urja Kabar says they're finding workarounds. Often they locate near restaurants or shops, hoping to get associated business. But more significantly, they sometimes charge based on the percentage of battery charged, rather than the actual kilowatt hours used.
Charging by percentage? How does that work?
It means they can effectively charge a higher rate, sometimes almost double what the pure electricity cost plus 20% would be. It makes the business work. But the article points out it's kind of a gray area. If regulators decided to strictly enforce the rules based on kilowatts are sold, these stations could be in trouble.
So it's a practical solution born out of necessity, but it lacks regulatory clarity and isn't transparent for the consumer. What solutions did Burj Kabar suggest?
They mentioned a few policy ideas, maybe allowing stations to charge a small fixed service fee on top of the electricity cost.
Okay, that makes sense.
Or the government could help by removing customs duty and subsidizing VAT on the charging equipment itself, lowering the initial investment cost. And maybe NEA could remove that 200 kVA limit on transformer support for private developers building bigger stations.
So basically, policy needs to catch up and create a clearer, more sustainable framework for the charging business.
Exactly. And speaking of policy catching up, inconsistency in government policy is flagged as another huge problem, potentially slowing things down.
How so? What changed?
Well, recently, around May 2025, the government announced they were increasing customs and excise duties on EVs by about 10%, with the rates varying more now based on the motor's power.
So walking back some of those initial favorable duties?
A bit, yes, making them slightly more expensive upfront again. But maybe the bigger hit, highlighted by Kathmandu Post back in April 2025, was from the central bank. They slashed the maximum bank financing available for EVs.
Slash it from what to what?
From that really helpful 90% loan-to-value ratio, they cut it way down to just 60%.
Wow, from 90 down to 60. That's a massive change.
It is. And get this.
Eh.
At the same time, they increased the maximum loan amount for petrol and diesel cars up to 60%.
So they simultaneously made EVs harder to finance and traditional cars easier. That seems counterintuitive if you want to promote EVs.
Exactly. It effectively wiped out a major financial advantage EVs had, especially for buyers relying on loans. And traders immediately warned this could cause EV sales to plummet potentially by half, according to Kathmandu Post, because so many buyers needed those higher loan amounts.
Did they see an immediate impact?
Yeah, the report said inquiries and bookings dropped off pretty quickly after the announcement.
What are experts saying about these kinds of policy shifts?
There's frustration. Stakeholders like the Bankers Association and people from the National Planning Commission basically warned against these sudden, unpredictable changes. They said it creates uncertainty, makes long-term planning impossible for businesses and consumers.
Yeah, you can't plan if the rules keep changing.
Exactly. And it even reportedly put off some international car makers who were apparently thinking about setting up local production in Nepal. They need stability. The call for a consistent, predictable government approach comes through loud and clear in sources like MyRepublica and Kathmandu Post.
This policy roller coaster feeds right back into the upfront cost issue, doesn't it? Even before these recent changes, EVs were often still pricier on the sticker, right?
Yes, Kathmandu Post and Rising Nepal reiterate that point. While the total cost of ownership might be lower, the initial purchase price is generally higher than a comparable IC car. They mention price ranges like 4 to 5.5 million rupees for popular EVs.
Which is roughly 30,000 to 40,000 US dollars or so.
Yeah, in that ballpark. And big electric buses are way more, like 15 to 20 million rupees.
So cutting the financing from 90% to 60% makes that higher initial price a much bigger hurdle again, especially for average buyers.
Precisely. Kathmandu Post really flags this as a major threat to keeping the adoption momentum going. You need that bigger down payment now.
And are there external factors that could push prices up too?
Kathmandu Post touches on that. Rising global costs for materials like lithium or changes in international trade, like U.S. tariff policies potentially impacting Chinese exports. That could all filter down and increase the price of EVs or their components imported into Nepal.
Okay, so policy shifts and financing changes are making upfront cost a bigger hurdle again. What about the batteries themselves? That's always a big topic with EVs.
Definitely. The battery is the single most expensive part, as noted on Reddit and confirmed by industry people. And the uncertainty around how long they'll last and what replacement will cost is a real worry, especially for the banks.
Why are the banks so concerned about battery life?
Well, MyRepublica explains their concern. They worry that a battery might need replacing in, say, 5 or 6 years for normal use, maybe even just 2 or 3 years, for a heavily used taxi or van. But the loans people take out to buy the EV are often for 7 or 8 years. So the banks see this risk. What if the battery dies before the loan is paid off? The owner suddenly faces a massive repair bill they can't afford, potentially defaults on the loan, and the bank gets stuck with a car that's basically worthless without a working battery.
Ah, I see. The loan duration outlasts the practical, reliable lifespan of the most critical, expensive component. That's a genuine risk for both borrower and lender.
Exactly. The source mentions insurance as a possible solution, but notes insurers also need more data and need to be prepared for this risk. And Reddit users also mentioned concerns about battery degradation, especially if the car isn't used regularly.
Are there any solutions mentioned, technically?
Well, that Reddit thread mentioned some DYD models might have easily swappable battery modules, which could make replacements simpler and maybe cheaper down the line. But the Tata interview stressed the general need to build up local capacity for battery repair and maintenance, suggesting it's still early days for that kind of service ecosystem in Nepal.
Is battery failure a common problem right now?
Interestingly, Mara Auto cited a study suggesting that while the small standard 12-volt battery causes breakdown issues fairly often, like in any car, major failures of the main high-voltage traction battery haven't been widely reported so far.
So maybe the fear is worse than the reality currently, or maybe it's just that most EVs are still relatively new.
Could be either or both. It's definitely an area to watch.
This whole battery issue touches on broader technical challenges, right? Like standards and expertise.
Yes. Experts like Dr. Bim Prasad Shrestha from Kathmandu University warned in My Republica about the risk of Nepal becoming an EV dumping site. Without clear technical standards for imported vehicles, there's a danger of low-quality or unsuitable EVs flooding the market.
Yeah, ensuring quality and safety is crucial. What about converting older cars?
My Republica also noted there's a lack of clear policies or standards for converting existing petrol-diesel vehicles to electric, which makes that option basically impractical right now, even though it could be beneficial.
And repairs, if something does go wrong with these new systems?
That's another gap. Several sources highlight the urgent need to train local mechanics and technicians. Servicing EVs requires totally different skills than working on traditional engines. Without trained people, even basic repairs become a major obstacle for owners.
Okay, so infrastructure, policy wobbles, cost and financing hurdles, battery uncertainties, technical standards, skills gaps. Are there challenges specific to certain types of vehicles, like buses?
Yes, definitely. Adoption of large electric buses and trucks is much slower. EA10.org and Rising Nepal explain the main reason is the huge upfront cost. Even with very low import tax, just 1% on buses over 14 seats.
Still too expensive for many operators.
Apparently so. Plus, the weak charging infrastructure outside main cities is a bigger problem for buses that need fast, reliable charging on routes. And just the generally chaotic nature of the public transport system makes big investments risky for operators.
So we're seeing only a few electric buses on the road.
Very few large ones, yeah.
Yeah.
Rising Nepal mentions the examples of Sasha Yatayaat and Sundar Yatayaat operating some, but HT Auto and Rising Nepal point out there are virtually no electric buses running between cities yet. That segment is lagging way behind passenger cars and tempos.
And what about just the driving conditions? Nepal's roads aren't exactly smooth highways.
That's another unique challenge. Research at Kathmandu University is looking into this specifically. Nepal's reality, poor road surfaces, heavy traffic jams, monsoon seasons, is very different from the standardized tests manufacturers use to calculate range and energy use.
So the actual range and efficiency people get could be quite different from the sticker.
Very likely, yes. The KU research aims to figure out how different, which is vital information for drivers and for planning infrastructure needs, realistically.
And finally, what about just people's perceptions? Is everyone fully on board with this EV revolution? That Reddit thread suggested some hesitation.
Right. Despite the boom, some people still prefer petrol cars. They mentioned practicality, needing higher ground clearance for rougher roads outside the city, the simple peace of mind knowing petrol stations are everywhere, and just general skepticism about whether claimed EV ranges hold up in real life.
So lingering doubts and practical concerns.
Yeah, and one user, Old Nepali Hippie, brought up some wider points questioning the long-term costs, the ethics and environmental footprint of mass-producing and shipping EVs globally. They also questioned if Nepal's narrow city streets can even handle lots of big EV SUVs, suggesting smaller EVs might be a better fit.
It's a good reminder that even with soaring sales numbers, there are diverse views and real concerns on the ground about how sustainable and practical this all is.
Definitely. So it's this picture of incredible speed and success, hitting world-leading adoption rates in some areas, driven by really strong economic and policy factors working together. But at the same time, it's bumping up against these serious interconnected roadblocks. Shaky policy, underdeveloped charging networks, worries about battery costs and life, missing technical skills and standards, and the sheer reality of operating these vehicles in Nepal's challenging conditions.
Okay, so looking ahead, how does Nepal navigate this? What do the sources suggest is the path forward to overcome these challenges and really lock in the benefits of this EV born?
Well, a really clear message comes through. This needs comprehensive government planning and sustained, consistent support. Urja Kabar, Rising Nepal, Kathmandu Post all emphasize this. It can't just be left to market forces alone.
And stability in policy seems paramount, right?
Absolutely crucial. Stakeholders quoted in MyRepublica and Kathmandu Post stress the need for stable, predictable rules, especially on taxes and financing. That's essential to keep investment flowing and build confidence for everyone involved, from buyers to potential manufacturers. Stop-start policies are seen as a major threat.
What about the charging infrastructure? What needs to happen there?
More investment, obviously, but also smarter investment. The sources talk about solutions like removing that transformer limit for private stations to encourage bigger hubs,
Right.
creating that centralized management system to make the network function better, maybe getting grants or technical help from development partners. And Fast Company mentioned exploring alternatives like battery swapping, too.
And tackling the battery concerns.
That's key for long-term trust. Ideas mentioned include developing specific insurance products to cover battery replacement risk,
Okay.
and, really importantly, building local capacity for battery repair, refurbishment, and eventually recycling. That helps manage end-of-life issues and could lower replacement costs, keeping expertise and value within Nepal.
And the technical side, standards and skills.
Seen as foundational, establishing clear quality and safety standards for imported EVs is vital to avoid becoming that dumping ground. And alongside that, setting up proper training programs for technicians is essential to actually maintain the growing fleet.
Okay, so addressing the challenges requires consistent policy, infrastructure investment, tackling battery issues, and building technical capacity. What about the opportunities? Where can Nepal go from here if they get this right?
The potential is significant. Some sources, like the Tata interview, suggest Nepal is already seen as a key case study in the region. It could become a leader, not just a follower, in the South Asian EV market. There's a big economic opportunity building out the whole ecosystem, domestically charging networks, specialized repair shops, maybe eventually component manufacturing or assembly plants, as Kathmandu Post hinted. That creates local jobs and value.
And it ties into their energy situation, right? The hydropower.
Exactly. Rising Nepal connects EV adoption directly to Nepal's huge hydropower potential. They're planning something like 28,500 milliwatt by 2035. Using that clean power domestically to fuel transport is strategically brilliant. It boosts energy security, creates demand for their own electricity, and displaces expensive imported oil.
A real win-win. Clean power for clean transport.
Pretty much. And it keeps reinforcing that benefit of saving foreign currency on oil imports, helping the trade balance a point that Rising Nepal and Kathmandu Post keep coming back to.
And the potential for local manufacturing is real if the conditions are right.
It seems so. Kathmandu Post mentioned that possibility being contingent on policy stability. And manufacturers like Tata are already showing commitment by working to bring EV models suited for South Asian conditions to Nepal quickly, seeing it as a priority market.
Okay, so putting it all together, the sources really paint this complex, dynamic picture. You've got this undeniable, almost explosive progress on EV adoption, amazing speed, incredible market share in some segments.
Yeah, truly remarkable on a global scale.
Driven by that potent mix of smart policy, huge cost savings, and the environmental plus of clean energy.
Right. But then you have these equally significant tangled challenges that needs serious attention.
Yeah.
The policy needs to be consistent, the charging network needs to be robust and sustainable, the battery issue needs long-term solutions, the technical skills need developing.
And it all needs to work within Nepal's unique real-world context.
Exactly. It leaves you with this really interesting, kind of provocative final thought, doesn't it? Looking at everything we've discussed from these sources.
Yeah.
Is Nepal brilliantly navigating a tough but ultimately rewarding energy transition, leveraging its natural hydro advantage to build a cleaner, more self-reliant future? Or, as some experts worry, is it moving so fast on vehicle imports that it risks becoming an EV dump ground if the standards, infrastructure, and policy don't keep pace, potentially facing big technical and financial headaches later on?
It's that tension between incredible opportunity and significant risk. What are the key things that will ultimately decide whether Nepal successfully sustains this ambitious EV journey? It's definitely a story that's still unfolding and one we should absolutely keep watching.